that. Well, let's bring you more now on the coup in Egypt. There's been cautious reaction to the unseating of President Mohamed Morsi's democratically elected government. In the United States, President Obama has said that he is deeply concerned and has requested that the Egyptian armed forces should move quickly and responsibly to return full authority back to a democratically elected civilian government as soon as possible. There's also been careful reactions from the British government and the UN.
It is the problem with a military intervention, of course, that it is a precedent for the future, and that if this can happen to one elected president, it can happen to another in the future. And that's why it's so important to entrench democratic institutions and for political leaders, for all their sakes and the sake of their country, to work on this together, to find the compromises that they haven't been able to make in Egypt over the last year. Now, we can't lay that down from outside. No other country can decide on that.
Military interference in the affairs of any state is of serious concern and is not consistent with fundamental democratic principles. Therefore, it will be crucial to quickly reinforce civilian rule in accordance with principles of democracy.
Well, the Muslim Brotherhood have reacted angrily to the coup in a press conference held earlier. A spokesman claimed that the Egyptian citizens who supported the military's action share responsibility for the fall of Mr. Morsi's government.
We put full responsibility on every person that participated in that coup and empowered it to happen. And we put responsibility on them, on anything, any harm happening to the person of the presidency, to the legitimacy of the nation, to Dr. Mohamed Morsi. And we call on them to momentarily end the illegitimate detainment of the president, of the elected president, between him and his people.
Well, before we discuss more broadly the international reaction to what's happened in Egypt, let's just show you this live shot, which is outside the presidential palace in the centre of Cairo, where again you can see a good deal of activity on the streets, just as there has been, of course, in Tahrir Square, pictures that we've been showing you a little bit earlier on. And just one line of interest which fits into this discussion about international reaction that I'm just reading from Reuters, that the Egyptian foreign minister has said that he's assured the US Secretary of State John Kerry in a telephone call that the overthrow of President Mohamed Morsi had not been a military coup. Well, let's dwell on all this now, because with me, journalist and Middle East analyst Nabila Ramdani and Yossi Meckelberg, lecturer in international relations at Regent's College and Middle East specialist at the think tank Chatham House. And we could also speak to Dr. Omar Ashur, who's a senior lecturer in Middle East politics at Exeter University. Thank you all very much for being a part of the conversation. Nabila Ramdani, let me start with you and the international reaction. I mentioned one or two examples of President Obama, Ban Ki-moon, William Hague. We've seen others as well. What do you make of what people have said and obviously been slightly reluctant to say here?
Well, yes, indeed, and the obvious word that nobody has used so far to condemn what's happened in Egypt internationally is the word coup. And we've just heard, from the US that John Kerry is now saying that it is not a coup. But
he was told it wasn't a coup, apparently, by the Egyptian foreign minister.
Well, it has all the hallmarks of a coup. The moment the military storms in a TV newsroom and prevents a president from making speeches and indeed deploys the army on the street and starts rounding up the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood and issues travel bans on them, then I think we can safely say that it's a coup, and it was done. All the clumsy cliché of post-colonial clichés of the coup were all played out yesterday. But I think more crucially, the American reaction stands out in particular as it is a friend of Egypt, really, and in particular of the military in Egypt. And it's particularly interested in its security and its stability. And President Obama, by not condemning what's happened as a coup, effectively legitimizes the demise of the removal of a democratically elected leader and all the much vaunted fight for freedom that the Americans are putting out. These lines will sound pretty hollow if the Americans do not condemn that.
Yossi Meckelberg, pick up on that theme.
It is a coup. You know, for all means and purposes, this is a coup. As Nabila says, the minute the military intervenes and removes a freely and democratically elected president, whether we like his policy, we don't like his policy, there is a lot of room to criticize a lot what he did in EU, but at the same time, he was elected in democratic election and the army intervened and removed him from power. The question where it leads for the United States and I think for the European Union at the same time is to make a decision. I think they're happy with the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood are not in power anymore, but at the same time they can't be happy if it won't lead to some democratic process, political process. And Egypt is in the process of building a nation building, in many ways, institutional building of something democratic, and it will take time. The question if the army is there to stay and to take control of the political process, or it will let something else to happen and organize a free election, which more groups will actually run for elections.
Just stay with the European reaction for a moment, because the German foreign minister went perhaps a little further than one or two of the examples we've just shown, Guido Westerwelle, describing the ousting as, and I quote, a serious setback for democracy, and called on all sides to refrain from violence and arbitrariness, as he put it. Is that going a little further than we've heard from the United States and from William Hague?
But there is no condemnation. I think what they're right and where the Foreign Secretary is right is that there is a very swift move towards free elections and to set the processes very quickly towards elections and setting a democratically elected government. But they can't guarantee. And I think in this sense, both the European Union and the United States are confused between the processes that are not happy and the end result that they would like to see.
Omar Ashur, let me bring you in on this. We've obviously been sitting here debating whether it's a coup or not and whether the international reaction should have been different from the one that we have seen. What's your take on that?
There is no other way to put it. It is a coup when you remove basically or annul 14 electoral, national-wide, free and fair democratic elections or electoral rounds. 6 of them were for the lower house of the parliament with the runoffs, and then 4 for the upper house of the parliament, and then 2 presidential rounds, and then 2 referendums, one in March 2011 for the constitutional declaration, another one in December 2012 for the constitution, which 64% voted yes for it. And then you annul all this by a group of military junta, no matter how much support they have on the ground. It's a coup. You annul the civilians. The civilians that won these elections are in jail now. The civilians who lost from these elections, we saw them behind General Sisi yesterday in support. So I don't see any other, being popular or being popular among a specific segment of Egyptian. This is Egypt versus Egypt. It's part of Egypt versus another part of Egypt. And the part that supported the coup is happy with it, of course, but the part that did not support the coup is not happy with it.
Okay. Okay. Let me go back to all three of you, actually, on this question that is perhaps raised by the one that we've been discussing, because this was posed as a question by one of the BBC's diplomatic correspondents online today. Is there such a thing as a good coup as opposed to a bad coup? Nabila Ramdani.
Well, I don't think so, because what it triggers is actually, it illustrates an unmitigated disaster, not only for the future of a democratic Egypt, but also for the spirit of the Arab Spring. And what it effectively created is a situation where the greatest fear at the moment is that you will have unsavory characters, fighters who will effectively would want to come into Egypt and want to win back the Muslim Brotherhood's mandate coming from volatile parts of the Middle East and North Africa. And that's a situation, so the scenario of a nightmare vision of a regional conflict pitting religious insurgents against highly trained, well-equipped Egyptian servicemen is by no means out of the question.
I suppose, Omar Ashur, just going back to you on that question I just posed, that analysis is about who you've got rid of, how it's done, and what it leads to, yes?
It's pretty much, yes. Basically, all of the cases that we have where an elected institution, regardless of what's the size of the majority, gets removed by the armed forces, this usually leads to negative consequences. And the negative consequences, either a military-dominated political scene, or a military dictatorship outright, or a civil war scenario. So in all of the cases, you're either giving the army the upper hand in politics, and this is not a democracy, or you have a military dictatorship, so with the repression and the corruption, and it's not a democracy, or violence and chaos and civil unrest, or a full-fledged civil war. We saw this multiple times in the last century, from Spain 1936 to Mossadegh in Iran 1953, to Chile in 1973, to Turkey in 1980, to Algeria in 1992, and Tajikistan 1992, Sudan 1989. So it's very clear patterns here that leads all of them to negative consequences. Now there is a point though here, because you mentioned the good coup.
Yep.
You had the case of Turkey 1997. The case of Turkey, it was a coup by memorandum. The army, or the National Security Council, dominated by the army, just sent the prime minister a note to resign, and he resigned. But what they did is they did not suspend the constitution, they did not dissolve the parliament, and they did not harass and arrest many of the activists, and they allowed the same figures and the same political party to run, and one of its offshoots, the AKP, became the dominant party since 2002. In Egypt, this did not happen. They suspended the constitution, they dissolved the parliament, and they are arresting the president and the figures that are supposedly loyal to him, including the employees, some of the employees in the presidential administrations, whose houses yesterday got stormed and searched.
Okay, let me bring Yossi Mekelberg in on a country that we haven't mentioned yet, namely Israel. What's the reaction there? What do you anticipate the reaction there to be?
What's interesting, there is no much reaction from
Well,
Israel.
I've been struck by the absence of it.
And the absence, I think, is striking. Is also the silence is deafening in this sense. And I think all the Arab Spring, all this process of the last 2.5 years was a sort of an humbling experience for Israel. For the first time, Israel, that is regarded as militarily as the strongest country in the region, thought it can, if not dictate what's happening in other countries, have a strong impact on what's happening, and at least to avoid impact back on Israel. All of a sudden, they realize they have very little impact on what's happening in the region. Whether it's in Syria or in Egypt or in Lebanon, any other country, things happening, and the maximum they can get, the best that they can get, is damage limitation. In other ways, that it won't spill over inside Israel. In many ways, Morsi was quite good to Israel. If you look at what happened, with all the fear of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Israel is surrounded by fundamentalists, and all the scaremongering that was around for many years about Islamic movement, in reality, he restrained the Hamas, he brokered the ceasefire with the Hamas back in November. He is an arch enemy of Iran, which Israel probably counts itself as well. So, and he destroyed some of the tunnels that lead the weapons to Gaza. So in many ways, this was not kind of what they thought he would.
And you mentioned Syria, Nabila Ramdani. I was not unduly surprised, and I don't suppose you were, to see that Bashar al-Assad welcomed events unreservedly. And that's quite telling as well, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And he also predicted the end of political Islam.
Which is clearly something which is very much in his interests.
Indeed, he's been fighting, as he's been saying all along, what he called jihadist and nasty al-Qaeda elements. And so he's happy to see the collapse, effectively, of the Muslim Brotherhood, which he equates, bizarrely, with the al-Qaeda elements. But I think he has a point there, in the sense that one has to be grim about the future of the Muslim Brotherhood, not only in Egypt, but also regionally. The new interim president is speaking of including the Muslim Brotherhood in a coalition government going forward. But this looks pretty unlikely when, at the same time, the military is effectively cracking down on the Muslim Brotherhood, as in the bad old days, excluding them from the political process. So their hopes to be part of any coalition are shattered. And in fact, they've proven, because of their appalling legacy in many ways, that they cannot be trusted with a democratic mandate.
OK, we could have talked a good deal longer, I'm sure. Thank you all very much indeed for taking part. Omar Ashur, thank you for your contributions from Exeter. Yossi Mekelberg, thank you. Nabila Ramdani, thank you very much as well. And you saw those scenes there, still live on the streets of Cairo. And just a line, I mentioned what has been said to John Kerry in this telephone call a moment ago, the Egyptian foreign minister, saying that he had assured Mr. Kerry that the overthrow of President Mohamed Morsi had not been a military coup. And of course, the significance sense of that, the definition of what happened in Egypt is important because the military overthrow of an elected leader would generally, I emphasise generally, trigger economic sanctions and could entail the cutting of vital US